The bell tolled 13 times that morning. No one corrected it. Outside, the fog clung to the alleys like the last breath of the dying, and the cobblestones glistened. Not with rain, but with the lye and ash they tossed to keep the pestilence at bay. You step outside, and the world smells of vinegar and smoke. A man passes you in a bird's mask, his beak filled with crushed roses and wormwood. He doesn't speak. No one does. Behind you, the door is nailed shut. Someone coughed. This is not a world of reason. It is a theatre of fear, lit by flickering candlelight and veiled in silence. And in this strange darkness, people reached for anything to survive. If this story unsettles your peace, or stirs something ancient in your bones, tell me, what would you have believed to keep your family alive? Subscribe, and walk with me deeper into the forgotten shadows of history. The bell rang 13 times that morning. Not 12, not the hour. 13. The toll of something unspeakable. You rose with its echo in your bones, a hollow sound that seemed to stretch the air thin. No name was announced, no procession followed, just silence, thick and breathing, hanging in the mist above the rooftops. The sun, pale and hesitant, painted the lavender hills with a dim gold that failed to warm the earth. Below, your village slept uneasily, cradled by vineyards and superstition. Somewhere, a dog barked and was answered by nothing. You stepped outside, and the world was different. The cobblestones were wet, not with rain, but with lye, scrubbed in fear. A sparrow flitted past, and did not sing. If this story stirs something beneath your skin, fear, wonder, memory, I invite you to share it. What part of you would speak if silence fell across your own doorstep? Tell me, when the bell rang 13 times, what would you have believed? You remember the smell before anything else, ash, rosemary, and the sharp sting of vinegar rising from the stones. It clung to your cloak and stung your nostrils, carried by the chilled wind that whispered through broken shutters and narrow alleys. The baker's stall, once loud with gossip and steaming crusts, now sat abandoned. The wooden shelves were bare, but for the shadows they held. A single loaf, days old, remained behind glass, untouched. The priest walked by that morning, but he no longer offered blessings. His eyes were red-rimmed, his hands wrapped in linen. He avoided your gaze. Once he would have placed a palm on your head, murmured Latin prayers as the bells rang for morning mass. Now he kept his distance, and the church door remained closed, sealed with wax, etched with ash. It was said that 3 of the choir boys had taken fever in the night. No candles were lit for them. Along the roadside, someone had scrawled a crude mark in coal, a circle with an X through its center. No one knew what it meant. Some claimed it was a ward, others said it was a curse. You stepped around it, careful not to touch. The plague had come not like thunder, but like fog, quietly, seeping through shutters and into beds, settling in the corners of rooms where lullabies once lived. At first it was rumors from the south, ships that never reached port, caravans that turned back early, towns where letters ceased to arrive. Then it was the coughing, sharp, wet and frantic, hidden behind shuttered windows and cloth soaked in brandy. You watched a mother wrap her child in cloth, stuffed with straw, her hands shaking as she tied lavender stems to his wrists. For Saint Sebastian, she whispered, though her voice cracked on the name. He did not answer. His face was pale, glistening with fever sweat, and he watched the ceiling as though it might crack open and reveal something merciful. You stood still, heart heavy in your chest. She did not ask for help. No one did anymore. Even grief had become private. A wagon rolled past slowly, its wheels shrieking against the stones. 2 men pulled it, their mouths wrapped in cloth, their hands thick with gloves. In the back lay a shape, barely covered. A hand, small and curled, poked from beneath the canvas. You looked away, so did everyone else. The marketplace, once the pulse of the village, beat no longer. The fountain in its center had gone dry, not from drought, but from fear. They said the water could carry it. They said anything could. Coins rusted in the trough, untouched. Chickens wandered freely, unchased. A boy once traded half an onion for 3 nails. Now he watched from a doorway, arms crossed, eyes far older than his face. There was a man who used to sing at dusk, an old mason with a voice like oiled leather. He had built the bridge that still stood at the village edge. You remember him now, only for the silence he left behind. That evening, you passed by the apothecary. His window was shuttered, the door marked with a red circle, and a strip of parchment that fluttered in the breeze. Quarantine, it read, a word that carried the weight of walls and endings, a word that tasted like metal and finality. The sun dipped low, its light bleeding into the hills. The lavender glowed like bruised gold. You sat beneath the old olive tree by the chapel and listened. The bell did not toll again that day, but you could still hear it, faint and heavy, echoing in the distance. Not from the steeple, but from memory. Night came quickly now, doors closed with haste, candles were snuffed early. Every cough in the dark was counted, every silence feared. And yet, amid the terror, something strange stirred. Not hope, not yet, but the ember of memory. You recalled a time when laughter filled the alleys, when bread warmed the air, when bells rang for weddings and festivals. That world had not ended, not yet. It slept, perhaps, somewhere beyond the fog. You rose, pulling your cloak close, and whispered a name, your own, perhaps, or one you'd nearly forgotten. The wind answered, cold and patient. In the distance an owl called out once, then was still. Behind you, the village breathed like something wounded but alive, and above, the stars blinked uncertainly, as though unsure whether to stay or flee. The lavender was tied with string the colour of rusted iron, a poor girl's ribbon that once held back hair but now held back fear. She placed it carefully into the neckline of her bodice, the sprigs brushing against her collarbone like a benediction. Her fingers moved quickly, as if the gesture Testec might ward off death. You saw her in the early light of morning, too early for merchants, too late for dreamers, as she stood alone in the square beneath the cracked statue of Saint Roch. Her lips moved silently, a prayer or a name she could no longer speak aloud. You followed her gaze toward the church, where windows once shimmered with stained glass and warmth. Now they were dull with soot and shadows. Someone had covered the entrance with rosemary garlands, bound tight with black twine. Each leaf was dry and brittle. They rustled faintly in the breeze like whispered confessions. The square was nearly empty. A few figures moved like ghosts between the stalls, their faces hidden by shawls, their steps muffled by dread. The fountains no longer bubbled. The air, heavy with the scent of decay and vinegar, clung to your lungs like smoke. Somewhere, unseen, a door slammed. No one turned. You wandered past the bread stall. The loaves were hard and colourless, untouched by hands or hunger. They sat beneath a muslin cloth dappled with old flour and newer dust. You could remember, if you tried, the laughter of the baker's daughter and the warmth of honeyed crusts pulled fresh from the oven. But those memories were like paintings left too long in the sun, faded, uncertain, and barely yours. The girl, the one with the lavender, had moved on, her steps taking her toward the apothecary's cart. Its wheels sat crooked on uneven stone, and the herbs it carried were half-rotted, crushed beneath the weight of desperate fingers. Small vials lined the edge, filled with cloudy liquids that shimmered like secrets. A sign hung above them, for purging of the plague. The price had been scrawled hastily over the original, now triple. She did not look at the bottles. She bent instead to gather a handful of crushed violets that had spilled across the stones. Her hands were trembling. You stepped closer. Her lips were chapped, and her cheeks flushed not with health, but with a fever just beginning to bloom. You recognized the look. You'd seen it in the baker's eyes, in the mason's daughter, in your own reflection yesterday morning. Someone called from a window above, a name, muffled and sharp, but no one responded. The girl tucked the violets into her sash and turned toward home. Her skirt brushed against your foot, and you saw then that she wore no shoes, just torn stockings, darkened at the heels by blood and dust. By midday the carts arrived, drawn by horses too thin to neigh, and pushed by men who spoke only in nods. They creaked and groaned through the alleys. You followed their path through the marketplace, past the shop where lace was once sold, past the old well where girls whispered secrets. The carts stopped before the chapel. There, beneath the cloth tarpaulin, they unloaded the dead, not lined or named, just laid side by side, limb against limb, stories silenced and uncounted. A boy had placed sprigs of orange peel between their fingers. Someone else had rubbed vinegar on their brows, too late. You watched as the priest, younger than you remembered, lifted his hands, said nothing and turned away. There were no more prayers left. A merchant passed you, his hands stained yellow with saffron. He spoke to no one, but you could see the fear coiled beneath his movements. He carried a satchel filled with crushed lemons and bitter herbs, which he pressed tightly to his chest like armor. Breathe citrus, you heard someone whisper once. It keeps the death from your lungs. That night, your neighbor soaked cloth in vinegar and wrapped it around her child's wrists. She burned sage at the threshold and placed a garlic bowl beneath his tongue. When he coughed, she did not flinch, only pressed him closer and sang an old lullaby with no real words. You listened through the wall. Her voice was cracked and raw, but it did not falter. In the alley, someone had set fire to a basket of rags. The smoke curled into the dark like a question no one wished to answer. Beneath your window, a woman placed oranges on the sill, not to eat, but to rot slowly, as though death might feed on their sweetness first. You lay on your back that evening, staring at the wooden beams above your bed. The scent of lavender still lingered, faint and tired. You wondered if it had ever helped the flowers, the herbs, the prayers muttered through cloth, or if belief alone had been the remedy, the only remedy anyone had left. In the morning they came for the girl. The cart was smaller this time. The men wore thicker gloves. Her mother followed behind, barefoot, carrying the lavender ribbon like a relic. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply walked until the cart vanished behind the chapel, then stood for a long while before turning home. You stepped outside, unsure why, perhaps to see the sky, or to smell the rosemary garlands, or to remind yourself that the world still turned. The air was still sharp, and the square was still quiet. But something had changed, not in the village, in you. A slow unraveling, a recognition that this, too, might not be enough, that the flowers would not save you, that the silence had grown teeth. Still, you picked up a sprig of crushed violet from the stone and slipped it into your sleeve. You did not know why, only that it felt right, that it smelled of something older than grief. And for one breath, one soft and unremarkable breath, you let yourself believe. The razor flashed in firelight, trembling just slightly in the barber's hand. He was an old man, though no older than this war with death had made him. You sat across the room, the wooden bench cold beneath you, the smell of iron thickening in your mouth. Before him lay a nobleman, cloaked not in velvet or silver this day, but in a wool blanket soaked through with sweat. His skin gleamed, pallid and waxen, his eyes sunken and red-rimmed. The fever had taken him 3 days ago, and now his breath was a rasp, shallow, hoarse, as though each inhale came from underwater. Outside, the wind wailed against the shutters like a grieving widow. Inside, all was silent, but for the cracking of the fire and the faint metallic trickle of blood into a brass bowl. It came slowly, dark and reluctant. The barber muttered to himself as he placed leeches on the man's forearm, watching them swell like bloated grapes. The humours must be balanced, he whispered. Too much blood, too much heat. You had heard the phrase 1,000 times now, spoken like scripture from lips too dry to believe it. They said illness came, not from the stars or the breath of death, but from imbalance in the blood, the bile, the wind within the belly. Let it out, they said. Drain the red and the black, then the body will remember its peace. The nobleman moaned softly. His wife, seated nearby, pressed a scented kerchief to her face and did not look up. You remembered her once, dressed in pearls at the May festival, her laughter rising above the lyre. Now she sat in the dark beside a man she barely recognized, waiting for his color to change. The barber wiped the blade clean on a strip of linen. The moon is in Cancer, he said, almost proudly, as if it explained everything. A watery sign, governs the stomach, the lungs. We bleed from the forearm when the moon is in Cancer. Otherwise, the balance collapses. You watched the man's breath grow slower. Watched the red swirl in the basin. The leeches had finished their work. Sated and thick, he would sleep now, the barber said. And tomorrow, perhaps he would rise. In the village square, a table had been laid out beneath an awning stitched with moth holes. A chalkboard beside it read, Astrological Consultations, 1 copper. The young physician stood beside it, eyes rimmed with ink and fatigue. He drew constellations across parchment, connecting stars with long sweeps of charcoal. You approached and offered him a coin. He nodded once, and without speaking, began to chart your fortune. The fever will come on a Tuesday, he said finally. Mars governs that day, hot and dry. You must eat figs soaked in vinegar and bathe beneath the stars, then sleep with basil under your tongue. If the stars are kind, you may survive. You took the parchment and said nothing. There were holes where the stars should have been. That night, the boy was brought to the chapel steps. His skin was blotched and feverish, his breath shallow. The priest refused to enter. Instead, they laid the boy in the porch's shadow. A healer came, wrapped in a grey cloak, and bled him with a silver knife. She did not smile. She did not look you in the eye. She whispered a name into the boy's ear, and left before the moon reached its peak. You waited beside him. He did not stir. The stars above were dimmed by a low mist, but still they flickered indifferent and far away. He tried to remember their names, Cassiopeia, Orion, the Weeping Twins, but they blurred like memories too long forgotten. The astrologers had said the stars told everything. Births, deaths, the moment to plant time, the moment to say goodbye. And yet, here on the stones, the boy did not move. The moon was high. The fever did not care. Across the village, someone cried out. A shriek, sudden and raw. You turned your head, but saw nothing. A candle flickered in an upstairs window. Then darkness again. Inside the apothecary, herbs had been bundled and sorted not by type, but by planet. Rue for Mars, yarrow for Mercury, wormwood for Saturn. The bottles were labelled with signs. Leo, Aries, Pisces, and dust clung to every cork. You reached for a vial, only to be scolded. That one, the old woman said, is for when the moon wanes. Yours is waxing. Do you wish to make it worse? You left with a bundle of horseradish and a folded scrap of parchment that read, Bleed on Thursday, after moonrise. Do not eat beans. You passed the weaver's shop. The loom was still. No one needed cloth now. They needed answers, and those did not come from thread. The weaver's son had died 2 nights ago. She had hung his favourite blanket in the window. The signal, they said, that she would not be touched. The fire burned low in your hearth, as you sat cross-legged on the stone floor, the parchment in your hands. You had pricked your thumb earlier, just to see the red, to see if something might feel released. It didn't. It only hurt. You thought of the nobleman and his wife, of the bowl filled with blood, of the stars marked on his wrist. You wondered what constellation governed mercy, if there was a sign for sorrow. At midnight, a storm moved in. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind moaned through every crack and doorframe. You curled into yourself, clutching the basil leaves someone had told you to chew before sleep. You listened to the thunder roll like distant drums, and you tried not to dream of blades. When morning came, the stars had vanished, and the fever remained. They began with rosemary and leather, a small fire, modest and trembling, set at the centre of the square. You stood just beyond its breath, watching the smoke coil into the air like a whisper ascending from an unseen mouth. It smelled sweet at first, familiar, like feast days and hearths, scent of lamb cooked slowly, of pine branches crushed beneath winter boots. But soon it turned acrid, sharp, astringent. The villagers added sulphur, then tar, then scraps of dried dung, not to warm themselves, not to cook, but to drive something out, to burn the bad air, to burn the No one spoke. Not even the priest, who had arrived in full vestments, sweat dripping from his brow as he threw salt into the flames. His eyes were wild. His prayers came out hoarse. He did not bless the crowd. He did not ask for offerings. He simply stood with his arms raised, as if commanding the fire to rise higher, to reach the sky itself, and choke whatever curse had settled above them. The children huddled close to their mothers, their faces buried in skirts and shawls. One boy, too young to understand, laughed as the smoke rose. His mother slapped him, not harshly, but enough to break the sound. Silence returned. It had been said, passed from mouth to ear in anxious rooms, that the air itself was poisoned, that the plague lived in the breeze, nestled in fog and breath, and the scent of unwashed skin. They called it miasma, and it was everywhere. In the sweat of a dying man, in the sigh of a stranger, in the stillness of your own breath, at night. So they burned. They burned juniper and rosemary, then sage and cowhide. They hung branches above doorways and waved them through the air, as if sweeping the sickness away. You joined them, not because you believed, but because you could not afford not to. The alternative to do nothing felt heavier than the smoke that coated your lungs. Behind the tavern, a man in rags lit a pile of old clothing aflame. He sang to it. A lullaby, you thought, though the words made no sense. He wept while he sang, but he did not stop. You watched him from a distance, your cloak pulled tight, and when the fire died down, he added more cloth. There was something ceremonial in his grief, like a funeral with no body, only smoke. The next day, they burned the market. Not the stalls themselves, but everything left behind: wilted cabbage, broken pots, unsold garlic braids. The square filled with flame and ash, and you stood at its edge, eyes stinging, face numb. The apothecary tossed in dried herbs from her shelf. Better ash than rot, she muttered. A friar wandered through the smoke with a censer swinging from his hand, his voice low and rough as he chanted a psalm. His robes were singed at the hem. His eyes never rose from the ground. You followed him as far as the chapel steps, but he disappeared behind the heavy doors, and you didn't dare enter. Not anymore. The birds began to vanish. First the swallows, then the sparrows. A raven sat alone atop the bell tower for 3 days, unmoving. Some took it as a sign, a watcher, a witness, perhaps an omen. Then it too was gone. Inside the houses, families built their own fires, small, pitiful things in tin basins or broken hearths. They lit them with pine cones, fish bones, candle ends. They fanned the smoke through hallways and bedrooms, hoping it might find whatever evil had nestled there and drive it out. Children coughed in their sleep. Windows were left open, even on cold nights. The air was no longer trusted. It had become a stranger. You lit a fire of your own. One evening, just rosemary and dried onion skins. The scent filled the room, quickly, pungent and earthy. You stood beside it, palms open, as though expecting the smoke to touch you gently. It did not. It clung. It filled your hair, your clothes, the lining of your throat, but for the first time in weeks, you slept without waking. In the morning, ash clung to everything: your bedding, the windowsill, your breath. Outside, the village was pale with it. It settled like snow. Even the chapel cross looked buried in soot. A young girl was caught setting fire to her brother's toys. She said the priest told her to burn everything he had touched. The priest denied it. But the toys were gone, and the child sat alone beneath the old oak, tracing smoke trails in the dust with her fingers. One by one, the fires grew larger. Wood became scarce, so they burned thatch, books, shoes. Someone set the old schoolhouse ablaze, not out of malice, but necessity. The smoke from it curled into the hills for days, and no one dared go near. The shepherd returned from the hills with no sheep, just smoke in his hair, and a single woolen glove, too small for his hand. He spoke of burning bodies, though no one had asked. He had dug a pit, he said. It took him hours. The wind had been strong. The flames had caught quickly. Too quickly. You left him there, still speaking, eyes fixed on nothing. And in the nights that followed, the smoke never cleared. It drifted between rooftops, soft and persistent, like a memory that refused to fade. It no longer stung. You had grown used to it. You breathed it in like anything else. Like grief. Like silence. You learned to read its patterns, how it curled before a death, how it faded after, how it danced on days when no one coughed, and how it sank low when the bells rang early. By the month's end, the stars were hidden behind a grey veil, and still the fires burned. Not because anyone still believed, but because they no longer knew how to stop. They came at dusk, barefoot and hooded, their backs striped with blood. You heard the drums first, low, steady, more heartbeat than rhythm, echoing down the valley like a storm in the bones. Then came the chanting. Latin, you thought, though the words were slurred with hunger. The sound wrapped around the village like a rope, drawing breath from every throat. You stepped into the alley, heart thudding, and there they were, the flagellants, 30, maybe 40 of them, moving in a long line through the dust. Men and women alike, robes darkened by sweat, lashes knotted and swinging behind them like serpents. Their faces were wrapped in cloth, their feet calloused, their eyes glassy with devotion or madness. You could not tell. At their front marched a boy, no older than 12, carrying a wooden crucifix twice his height. It wobbled with every step, the burden clearly too great for his narrow shoulders. Behind him, a woman sang. Her voice was broken, thin as moth wings, but she did not stop. The same hymn, over and over, a lullaby for a world that no longer slept. They claimed to be holy, to be chosen. They had walked from the north, they said, through forests of corpses and cities without breath. They had seen angels in the plague pits, demons in the smoke. They were not here to heal, they said. They were here to suffer in your place. The villagers watched from doorways, eyes wide and unblinking. No one spoke. Even the dogs were silent. The flagellants halted in the square, forming a circle around the well. One by one, they fell to their knees. A man stepped forward, his robe hanging in tatters, and raised his arms to the reddening sky. He called out names, saints, martyrs, forgotten prophets. Then he tore the robe from his back and lifted the scourge. You watched as he struck himself, once, twice, 10 times. The skin split like fruit overripe in the sun. Blood fell to the cobblestones, thin and bright. He cried out, not in pain, but in praise. The others followed, lashes cracking like dry branches, bodies swaying with each blow. The rhythm grew frenzied, like a storm beating against the earth. You felt the air shift. The smell of blood, mixed with the smoke still lingering from yesterday's fires. Someone dropped to their knees beside you, whispering a prayer they did not understand. You stepped backward, one pace, then another. They stayed until the stars came out. When they rose, their robes were soaked, their lashes coiled like snakes at their feet. They lit no fires, ate no food, only drank from the well, blessing it with their wounds. Then they marched onward, toward the southern road, the boy with the cross still leading them, his legs shaking with each step. By morning they were gone. Only the blood remained, a pool near the fountain, thick and half-dried. Children poked at it with sticks. Their mothers dragged them away. You sat in the church that afternoon, though no priest stood at the altar. The statue of Saint Sebastian had been stripped of its garlands. Someone had wrapped a cloth around his eyes. You stared at him for a long time, wondering if even the saints wished not to see. In the days that followed, more processions came. Smaller groups, stranger chants. One man claimed to be the risen soul of a martyred bishop. Another said he could cure the plague with a touch, but died before sundown. A woman covered herself in ashes and sang from the rooftops until her voice cracked into nothing. The village, once skeptical, began to follow. They joined the processions, flagellated themselves behind shuttered doors, chanted until their tongues grew thick. A kind of madness took hold, not chaotic, but holy. A shared delirium of purpose. Better to bleed by choice than rot in silence. You found yourself watching the road more often, waiting for the next line of martyrs to arrive. You dreamt of drums in the night, of scourges trailing flame, of saints with hollow eyes who smiled when they struck the earth. One evening you passed the girl with the red shawl, the one who had lost her brother 2 weeks ago. She stood barefoot in the square, a lash dangling from her hand. Her back was untouched. Her eyes met yours. "I haven't earned it yet," she whispered. That night, the village held its own procession. No outsiders, just neighbors, friends. You walked behind them, steps slow, unsure if you believed or only feared being left behind. The air shimmered with candlelight and song. It felt like worship or surrender. The next morning, a boy was found dead beneath the olive tree, a leather cord still wrapped around his wrist. No one claimed to know him. The priest returned to the altar that week, his sermons shorter, quieter. He spoke of sacrifice, of blood as offering, of pain as prayer. You no longer recognized his voice. When you closed your eyes at night, you heard the lashes, not in violence, in rhythm, like rain on stone, like penance humming through the bones of the world. And sometimes you found yourself whispering names into the dark, not of saints, but of those you'd lost, as if suffering might call them back, as if enough pain might open heaven's gates. He stood in the doorway like a creature from another world, cloaked in waxed linen, gloves to the elbow, and a beaked mask that turned his face into something more bird than man. The beak was long and curved, stuffed with herbs and petals, stitched tight with thread the color of rust. You could not see his eyes, only the faint gleam of glass behind the sockets. He did not speak, he merely nodded once, then entered your neighbour's home. You watched from across the street, breath held behind the cloth tied over your mouth. No one moved. No one followed. The door closed behind him with a sound like finality. The wind picked up just then, carrying with it the mingled scents of marjoram, vinegar, sweat and grief. They called them plague doctors, though few believed they healed anything. They were shadows in the fog, harbingers of death and formality. They walked not with urgency, but with ritual, their footsteps heavy, their presence unbearable. And yet they came. You remember when the first arrived, a tall figure from Florence, face already hidden, voice thick with an accent none could place. He carried a cane, tapping it against the floor with each step, not for support but to maintain distance. If someone came too near, he raised it sharply, like a threat or a warning. He carried no medicine, only pouches of herbs, strips of linen, and wax-sealed scrolls, filled with instructions no one could read. Inside the homes, they moved carefully. They did not touch the living, only the dying and the dead. Later that day, the doctor emerged from your neighbour's home, his robes smudged, the end of his beak darkened with damp. He lit a small fire outside the door, dropped a bundle of sage into it, and held his sleeves above the flame, a kind of washing, a kind of mourning. Then he walked on without looking back. The bodies were prepared differently now. Perfume was no longer luxury. It was armour. The dead were anointed with rose oil, their faces powdered, their clothes soaked in citrus water, not out of reverence but fear. You stood beside a bier once as a mother wiped her daughter's face with orange peel, over and over, whispering that it would stop the stink, that she would be beautiful again. The girl's lips were already blue. The apothecary sold scent bundles by the dozen, little sacks of mint, hyssop and cloves, to be worn beneath the chin or behind the ear. The richer families carried pomanders, orbs of silver, carved like lace, filled with crushed blossoms and camphor. You once saw a child playing with one, not knowing its purpose, laughing as it rolled across the dirt. The smell of the village had changed. Not to something better, just stranger. Death did not hide. It paraded now beneath layers of lavender and resin. Each passing cart carried not just bodies, but clouds of perfume, overwhelming and sharp. Your stomach often turned before your heart did. Inside the chapel, incense was burned day and night. The altar gleamed with new polish. The air was thick, hard to breathe. The priest no longer touched the sick. He pressed relics against their foreheads with gloved hands, whispered prayers from a safe distance, then crossed himself 3 times. One evening you helped prepare a body, a cousin, not close, but not forgotten. She had died in sleep, a rare kindness. You laid her out on the floor of her home, the shutters thrown wide, a rosemary candle flickering at her feet. Her skin had already lost its warmth. Her hands, once nimble with cloth and needle, lay still as stones. You washed her with rose water, as instructed, rubbed her skin with sage, and wrapped her in linen soaked in orange peel tea. You tied a sachet of marigold around her neck, and placed cloves between her fingers. When it was done, you stepped outside and vomited into the garden. The scent would not leave your throat. The next day, the plague doctor came. Not the one from Florence. A new figure, shorter, shoulders stooped. The same mask. The same silence. He examined the body with a stick, lifted the shroud with the edge of his cane, then nodded once. Approval, perhaps, or pity, you could not tell. You left without speaking, but you found a slip of parchment tucked beneath a jar of balm. An instruction: burn the bedclothes, boil the floorboards with vinegar, do not re-enter for 5 days. You followed it, every word. The fire took all her belongings. The scent lingered in the ashes. Children began to mimic the doctors, fashioning beaked masks from leather scraps and wood. They paraded in the square, poking one another with sticks, pretending to save or condemn. Laughter came with it, bright and jarring. Their mothers scolded them, but part of you found comfort in it, as if the mask, once feared, had become something less monstrous, less final. And yet, even as the children played, the real beaked ones continued to come and go. They never removed their masks, never showed their skin. Some said they slept standing. Others claimed they were priests in disguise, or angels, or death itself behind glass eyes. One day you passed a mask hanging from a post, empty. No body, no cloak, just the beak swaying gently in the breeze. You stopped and stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it meant something had ended, or just begun. You pressed a sprig of hyssop to your lips. The perfume stung your nose. You could still smell the dead beneath it, and when you closed your eyes that night, the beak came to you in dreams, not as terror, but as a question. How close could one come to death, before becoming it? The door creaked as you pushed it open, its hinges protesting against years of damp and dust. Inside, the air was thick, not with rot, but with the strange sweetness of dried flowers and oils gone rancid. The shelves groaned beneath jars and bundles, each labelled in a hand so old it looked as though written by candlelight alone. The apothecary's hut had once been tidy. Now it seemed like a graveyard of faith, filled with broken certainties and bottled hope. She stood behind the counter, hair unbound, and hands dyed green, with the juices of things no longer named. The widow. No one remembered her real name anymore, only that she had lost her husband to fever, and her son the week after, and that she had not left this room since. Some said she spoke with angels, others said she had gone mad. You weren't sure which would have been the kinder truth. She looked up as you entered, but said nothing. Only gestured to the stool by the hearth. A pot simmered there, thick and bubbling, the colour of rust and ash. You sat. She dropped a feather into the pot, and it hissed like a snake. On the table beside her lay a rooster's heart, small, dark, still glistening. Beside it, a mortar held something that glittered faintly red, crushed rubies, stolen or gifted, no one knew. A dead toad, its skin tight and glistening, was curled in a copper bowl, its belly carved open and stuffed with fennel. She sprinkled powdered sapphire into its mouth. You watched her work, the way her fingers moved, deliberate, soft, almost tender, as if she believed that somewhere in these twisted ingredients a cure might still bloom. She muttered, as she stirred, a chant in no language you recognized. "You put the heart near the bed," she said at last, her voice dry as bone. "Let it draw the sickness from the lungs. The toad, you wear it, in a pouch, over the chest. It will darken when it begins to work." You nodded. You didn't ask why. No one asked why anymore. In the villages, people wore strange talismans now. Dried lizards sewn into sleeves, teeth wrapped in linen and tied to belts, feathers braided into hair. A man was seen walking the road with garlic rings around his neck and a hedgehog skin strapped to his thigh. Another buried his boots beneath the threshold each night and dug them up again, come morning believing the earth would drain the poison. The old woman down by the orchard kept a jar of spiders in her window, said they caught the sickness in their webs. She swore by it. Her son had lasted 3 days longer than the others. You returned home that night with a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth. Inside, the ruby paste, the toad, the rooster's heart, still faintly warm. You placed them gently on the table, hands trembling. Your sister was coughing now, soft, but regular. You'd hidden it from the others, from yourself. You placed the heart beneath her cot, just as the widow had said, hung the toad by its string above the headboard, watching as it turned slowly in the candlelight. You rubbed the ruby paste along her collarbones. It smelled of iron and lilac. She whimpered in her sleep. In the days that followed, the remedies multiplied. Someone claimed onions could pull the sickness from the skin. Soon, every home reeked of them, sliced, boiled, hung in bunches from rafters. Others swore by jewels that emeralds worn near the heart could ward off fever. A beggar was seen trading his last loaf for a cracked amethyst. He died in a ditch the next morning, the stone still clutched in his palm. A healer from the coast arrived with a satchel full of powdered horn and crushed coral. He sold small wooden figures, saints, he said, carved during storms. They remember the wind, he told you, tapping one against his teeth. They'll carry the sickness away. The villagers began to carry leeches in little jars, feeding them bits of apple to keep them strong. Others caught frogs, split their bellies, and pressed them to their skin, waiting for the colour to change. If the frog turned black, they believed it had absorbed the illness. If it died, which it always did, they burned it and wept. Even the church joined in. A monk began blessing stones, dipped in holy water, mixed with ground amber. He gave them to the children first. Miracles are smaller now, he said, and smiled. 2 days later, he was buried behind the chapel, his stones scattered like coins in the grass. You opened the windows in your home and laid branches of nettle across the sill. Your sister still coughed. You crushed wormwood into a tea, and slipped bay leaves into her shoes. You tied a snake's rib around her ankle, just as the widow had instructed. You slept beside her bed each night, listening, counting her breaths. The toad above her head never darkened. The heart beneath the bed began to rot. Still, you kept it there, because the strangest thing of all was not that these cures existed, it was that they comforted you. That in the face of a death so vast and voiceless, even the ruby toad in the rooster's heart felt like answers, like prayers, clumsy but true. You sat in the darkness one night, pressing the jewel dust between your fingers, and thought perhaps it is not the cure that matters, perhaps only the hope. And hope, however strange, was the one thing they hadn't yet buried. The morning began with a trail of soot, a perfect circle drawn around a cottage at the edge of the village. You saw it first in the blue light of dawn, when the world still held its breath, and the frost had not yet melted from the thatch. The soot was thick, deliberate, laid down in the dead of night, not scattered, but shaped, a barrier, a prayer, a threat. The family inside had not emerged. You stepped closer, careful not to cross the line. A single feather lay just beyond it, curled like a question mark. You recognized the mark on the door, an open eye, painted in charcoal, with a drop of blood where the pupil should be. Someone had added garlic braids to the lintel and pressed an egg into the doorframe. Still raw, still whole. No one admitted to drawing the line, but everyone understood its meaning. They believed the sickness could not pass through certain things, not out of reason, but instinct. Salt, ash, iron nails crossed beneath thresholds, the bones of birds buried at sunrise. You'd seen all of it. You'd done most of it yourself. There were whispers of a woman up in the hills who used chalk to draw sigils on her walls, symbols so old that even the priests couldn't name them. They said her family remained untouched. They said her pigs still gave birth. Her well remained clear. They said she had wings. No one had gone to see her. Not yet. In the square, someone had placed a row of salt lines between the bakery and the inn, each line broken by sprigs of thyme. A merchant knelt nearby, holding a book of old recipes, not for food, but for protection. He whispered the ingredients as though they were gospel. Salt became scarce. Then soot. Then chalk. People began grinding bones for dust, smearing ash from their hearths into crude runes along their walls. You saw symbols scratched into the bark of olive trees, drawn in the dirt beneath windows, painted in ochre on the backs of doors. You traced one once, with your finger, a loop inside a square, surrounded by 7 dots. You felt nothing, but when you closed your eyes, you dreamed of heat and feathers, and the taste of copper on your tongue. A woman down the road had surrounded her home with a ring of nettles, weaving in strands of her own hair. "It listens," she said. "It will protect us." Her husband stood behind her, holding their infant to his chest, eyes wide with silence. You nodded and left. The carpenter smeared clay mixed with vinegar across the outer wall of his shop, then added fish scales, then crushed cloves. When asked why, he only said, "The dreams told me." You didn't ask what kind. One man buried a rooster's skull beneath each corner of his garden, and placed a pebble from the church steps in the center. He offered no explanation. No one asked for one. By then, explanation had become unnecessary. Fear had its own language. That evening a storm rolled in, low and sullen, the sky green with warning. Wind tore through the village like a message, flinging shutters open and carrying smoke through the alleys. You helped a neighbor relight her lanterns, then watched as she traced a circle around her daughter's bed, using crushed pepper and dried lemon rind. "To keep the death from dreaming her," she whispered. Your own doorway bore the marks now. 3 lines of soot, a twist of rosemary, and a smear of red clay. You had placed a horseshoe above the lintel, though it hung crooked and rusted. Beneath your bed you kept a pouch of salt tied with string, changed each night as the candle burned low. That night, you sat awake, listening to the wind scrape its knuckles against the shutters. The symbols in the corners of your home seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight, like eyes blinking in slow rhythm. You did not blink back. At midnight, You heard someone outside. Footsteps, slow and circling. You held your breath. The sound passed. You did not move. Morning came like a question. In the light of dawn, you found a new symbol on your door, not one you'd drawn. A spiral, tight and trembling, with a feather pressed into its center. You didn't remove it. The next day, the family in the soot circle emerged. Alive, pale, thin, their eyes like hollows carved from snow, but alive. The village gathered. No one spoke. The father raised a hand, fingers trembling, and then walked slowly into the square. No one touched him, but no one stopped him either. A change settled over the village then, not of relief, but of certainty, that the lines worked, that the ash had listened, that the feather had spoken. By week's end, every house bore a circle, every threshold had its talisman. Children were taught the symbols before their own names. You saw them drawing them in the dirt, with sticks, humming songs that had no words. You no longer questioned it. One morning you sat in your doorway and watched the wind. You saw it hesitate at the line of salt, curl above the circle of soot, turn away, and you whispered, not a prayer, but something older, something that felt like protection. You arrived just as the chains were drawn tight. Thick iron links looped through the wooden handles of the north gate, fastened with a rusted lock too large for one hand. A sign hung above it, scribbled in haste, the ink smeared by wind and rain. No entry, no exit, by order. The guards did not meet your eyes. One leaned on a pike, the other clutched a rag to his mouth, both pale beneath their helmets. You stepped back as a cart approached, its driver pleading softly. A child curled beneath a blanket in the back. He begged for mercy, but the lock did not budge. The gate stayed shut. The man wept, then turned away. This was not a town anymore. It was a wound trying to close itself. You circled the walls, stone worn smooth with time and moss, and found no weakness. Every entrance sealed, every ladder removed. The guards patrolled without speaking, eyes red from smoke or sleeplessness. From within you could hear life quiet, strained. A dog barked once, a bell rang faintly, then silence. A quarantine, they called it. Protection, containment. But what it truly became was separation. From kin, from comfort, from the old rhythms of the world. Those within no longer sent letters, those without stopped expecting them. By nightfall, you found lodging in a barn outside the southern wall, along with 12 others who had arrived too late. A mason, a milkmaid, 2 monks with tired eyes. Each sat alone, though you shared the same straw, the same cold, the same fear. You learned that the town had closed itself 3 weeks prior, after the apothecary's assistant collapsed in the street. Within days, 5 more followed. The mayor ordered the closure. His own wife fell ill the morning after. Rumors swirled like crows. Some said she'd been buried in secret, others that she still wandered the halls, wrapped in rose-scented cloth. Inside the walls, life turned inward. The market, once noisy with barter and song, now passed in silence. Coins were no longer touched, dropped instead into vinegar baths. Vendors wore gloves, scarves, anything they could find. Bread was sold without words. Fish wrapped 3 times before it left the cart. There were no crowds, only lines, long, still, and fearful. A woman who once sold lace began carving small wooden tokens, pressing them into strangers' palms in exchange for food. Luck, she whispered. Luck remembers those who believe in it. Inside the chapel, only the priest and one altar boy remained. They rang the bell at dusk each evening, not for mass, but for the dead. 1 ring per name. Some nights it rang 30 times, some nights not at all. The villagers came to dread the silence more than the toll. The children played differently. No longer games of chase or hide and seek. Now they walked in lines, mimicking the plague doctors, their hands outstretched, their voices low. They drew maps of the town in the dirt, marking which houses were hot and which were not. They laughed less. Within the walls, suspicion festered. A man sneezed in the bakery, and by afternoon the shutters were nailed shut. Another left his home after curfew and was found beaten, his mouth stuffed with rosemary. No one admitted to it, but the mayor's new decree allowed such things now. Order must be kept. The living must be protected. Families turned on one another. A brother locked his sister in the cellar after her skin turned pale. She screamed for 3 days. On the 4th, she fell quiet. He told the priest it was God's will. The priest did not answer. Outside the walls, you watched smoke rise in the evenings. Small, controlled fires to burn cloth, herbs, fear. You and the others shared bread and silence. One night, the masons spoke of a tunnel beneath the eastern wall, once used for drainage. You all looked at each other, but said nothing. Some boundaries must not be crossed, even by desperation. A week passed. Then another. The milkmaid was the first to leave, walking north with no bundle, no farewell. The monks vanished next, slipping into the fog before dawn. You stayed. Not because you trusted the wall, but because the world beyond it had grown even more foreign. On the 12th night, a lantern flickered atop the wall. A figure stood there, motionless. You rose to greet them, but they did not wave. Instead, they lowered something down on a rope, a basket wrapped in cloth. Inside, bread, a single apple, and a note, scrawled hastily. "We remember you." You wept then, not out of hunger, but recognition. The next morning, the chains still held. The signs still hung. The guards still watched without blinking. But something in you had shifted. There was life on both sides of the wall, even here, in the stillness of fear. The well stood at the heart of the village, like a mouth that no longer sang. Its stones, once cool and damp with the scent of earth, were dry to the touch now. You stood beside it in the thin morning light, and all you could hear was the wind brushing gently through the bones of the olive trees. No laughter, no footsteps, no splash of water drawn in buckets, just silence thick as ash, heavy as sleep. A doll lay beside the well, limp, weather-stained, missing one arm. You recognized the ribbon tied around its neck, pale yellow, frayed at the ends. It had once belonged to Livia, the baker's daughter, who wore it proudly every Sunday as she spun in circles near the fountain. You had not seen her in 5 days. Her father's windows were boarded now. The silence pressed in from all sides. There was no bird song, only the distant creak of empty carts and the faint hum of wind through chimney flues. You crossed the square slowly, your boots leaving faint prints in the dust that no one followed. The market stalls stood abandoned, produce wilted in baskets, blackened by time and flies. The loaf of bread sat untouched on a stone bench, already hard as bone. The tavern's door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, the tables were set for meals, never served, wooden bowls filled with dried herbs, tankards with nothing left to spill. The fire was cold. A single chair lay tipped on its side, as if someone had left in haste, or not at all. You passed by the butcher's house. The windows had been painted over in white, the brushstrokes uneven. Panicked, a handprint stained one pane. Not fresh, but still visible. You remembered the butcher's son, chasing chickens through the alleyway, laughing like a bell. Now there were no chickens, no laughter, just that hand on the glass, frozen mid-reach. The stillness had changed the way people moved. Those who remained walked without sound, steps muffled by caution. Eyes stayed low. Doors opened only as wide as necessary, and closed with soft finality. Children no longer called to one another. Even the dogs had stopped barking. In the chapel, the candles flickered, but no voices rose in prayer. The priest lit them each morning with trembling hands, saying nothing, singing nothing. His homilies had faded into whispers. The saints stared down in silence from their carved perches, their wooden eyes dulled by smoke and dust. A woman sat beneath the fig tree near the square, arms wrapped around her knees, humming to herself, not a song, just a sound, repetitive, steady, like the ticking of a clock in a house long abandoned. You did not disturb her. You feared that if she stopped, the silence would win. At the edge of the village, the old well, the second one, near the orchard, had been covered with stones. Not because it had run dry, but because someone had fallen in. A boy, they said. His mother found his shoes, but not his voice. They filled the mouth with rocks. The next day, you had helped carry one too large for your arms, scraping your palms raw as you dropped it in. It thudded hollowly. Then nothing. The weight of absence grew heavier than grief. Everywhere you looked, something was missing. A broom left mid-sweep, a window left open to the cold, a coat still hanging by a door. The village was not empty, but it felt paused, as if time itself had stepped out and forgotten to return. That evening, you returned to the central well. The doll still lay there, its one remaining eye staring upward. You sat beside it, feeling the coolness of the stones seep into your bones. You thought of the water that once flowed clear, cold, drawn by laughter and song, of the hands that passed buckets down, passed cups up, shared the cool relief of Earth's generosity. Now the rope hung limp, the pulley stiff with disuse. You listened, not for footsteps, not for voices, but for the faintest sound of water. There was none. Behind you, a shutter creaked, then closed. You looked to the hills and saw smoke from a single chimney. Someone else still lived. Someone else still breathed. But they too were quiet. And in that silence, you heard other things. Your own heart, the hush of your own breath, the distant echo of things that had been, a girl's laugh, a song sung to a child, the sound of a bucket breaking the surface of the well. You closed your eyes. And you remembered, not the sickness, not the fear, but the fullness that once was. The sound of water, the joy of its rise, the splash of it in a basin, cool against a sun-warmed face. You stayed until the stars came out, silent above the silence. Then you rose, picked up the doll, and carried it home. You found it on the wall of the old chapel, just below the broken window where the light no longer reached. A single line, drawn in what looked like soot, or maybe coal, or blood darkened by time, smeared across stone in hurried, trembling strokes. Deliver us from this shadow, O Lord, and do not turn your face away. The letters were crude, uneven, some dripped downward like tears. You ran your fingers near them, but did not touch. The ash crumbled at the breath of your presence, as if even memory had grown too fragile to bear. The chapel was nearly empty now. The pews, once filled with folded hands and soft murmurs, stood bare and silent. Dust clung to every surface. The altar cloth had been taken, repurposed perhaps for bandages or burial wrappings. A few dried petals from a long-dead bouquet still lay beneath the statue of the Virgin, curled like tiny hands. You sat on the back pew, listening to the quiet. The priest had not returned for days. Some said he had gone into the hills to pray. Others said he had taken the last rites into homes too, cursed to survive. A boy claimed he saw the priest walking barefoot through the graveyard at night, speaking to the stones. No one asked questions anymore. No one sought certainty. There were no sermons now, only silence, and the ache of faith where faith used to bloom. You thought back to the first time you'd entered this chapel. As a child, your fingers tucked inside your mother's palm, the incense thick in the air, the stained glass glowing like fire, the sound of the bell echoing through your chest, like a heartbeat not your own. You remembered kneeling beside her, whispering secrets into folded hands, believing that someone heard. Now you weren't sure. You weren't alone in that. The old women still lit candles each morning, but their prayers were hushed, fractured, interrupted by coughs. A boy had carved a cross into the wooden door with a knife, deep and jagged, as though trying to make the shape permanent in a world where nothing else remained. Someone had placed garlic at the foot of the crucifix. Inside the confessional, dust lay so thick you could draw lines through it. No one entered anymore. What would they confess? That they had survived while others had not? That they doubted? That they still hoped? You moved through the aisles, brushing your hand along the stone wall, the air cold enough to bite. As you passed beneath the choir loft, you saw another prayer, smaller, this time, carved into the wood of a beam. Forgive me, I kept the bread for myself. No name, just truth. And perhaps that was prayer enough now. Not the recitations of scripture, but the whispered guilt of those still breathing, those who had eaten while others starved, those who had closed their doors to coughing neighbours, those who had chosen silence when screams rang out at night. At the far end of the chapel, beneath the flickering remnants of the stained glass, you knelt, not because you believed, but because your knees remembered how the cold seeped through your cloak. Your fingers curled around the hem of your sleeve. You whispered no words. There were none left. Still something stirred, not a sound, not light, only memory of voices once raised in harmony, of incense clinging to skin, of a priest's voice cracking as he spoke of mercy. You rose, slowly, and left a coin on the altar, not for offering, but remembrance. Then you stepped outside, back into the wind. Across the square, a woman knelt before a shuttered door, fingers pressed to the wood. She didn't knock, she only rested there, as though feeling for a heartbeat through the grain. That night, you returned with chalk, and though your hand trembled, you wrote your own prayer on the chapel wall, beneath the others. Simple, wordless, a mark, a circle, closed. You sat in the nave until morning, watching the light crawl through what remained of the windows, turning the dust into gold. You did not ask for salvation, only to be remembered. It was marked in red, thick strokes of pigment, clumsily applied, each line drying unevenly on the wood. A rough cross, slashed across the planks like a wound. Below it, a smear of something darker. You did not need to ask what. You had seen enough doors like this now to know. This one belonged to the Weavers family. You remembered their laughter, how it spilled from the windows during feast days, how the mother sang while hanging linen from the sill. The scent of soap and warm cloth used to drift from this place like a second language. But now the shutters were bolted, the air around it silent. The song had ended days ago. You stood in the alley alone, heart tight, hand half raised toward the wood. But you didn't knock. No one did. That was the rule. The red meant silence. The red meant don't touch. Still, you waited. Sometimes the curtains would stir. A shadow would cross the window. A cough once had escaped through the cracks in the door, sharp and wet like something tearing loose from a soul. You remember clutching your cloak tighter then, not out of fear, but out of helplessness. A week ago, the baker's home had looked just like this. You had passed it every day, the red cross slowly darkening in the sun. Then one morning, the door stood open, not wide, just enough for the smell to escape. No one entered. By nightfall, a pair of men arrived with cloth over their faces and straw bundles for the fire. The house is gone now, only ash remains. But the weaver's door, it still stood. You thought of her daughter, the girl with the yellow scarf, the one who used to chase chickens with bare feet and laughter sharp as bells. She once traded you a button for a plum. You hadn't seen her since the cross appeared. He left a crust of bread on the step that evening, not out of charity but memory. In the days that followed, the door did not open. Others noticed. A boy left a candle. A woman set down a sprig of rosemary. Small gestures, quiet, like burying prayers. No one spoke aloud, but everyone remembered. One afternoon, you saw a figure standing beside the door, a man, cloaked and still, as if carved from the same wood. You watched him from across the alley. He didn't knock, just laid his hand flat against the red mark, rested his forehead there for a moment, and then turned away. His eyes met yours only briefly. They were red-rimmed hollow. He said nothing. Later, you learned he was the weaver's eldest son, returned too late. That night, the wind carried a scent, bitter and faintly sweet, like herbs burning low. You crept closer and saw smoke seeping from the chimney. A candle still flickered behind the curtain, but the silence inside was absolute. You dreamed of the girl with the yellow scarf. She was dancing through a field of linen, arms outstretched, the fabric snapping in a wind you couldn't feel. She smiled at you, then vanished. In the morning, the door remained shut. The bread was gone. You left another. The carpenter told you, days later, that he once tried to count how many red-marked doors had appeared in the village. He stopped at 42. I didn't want to know the rest, he said, voice low. Knowing doesn't help the heart. You passed those doors now like gravestones. Familiar, silent, each one telling a story no one could finish. Some bore flowers at their base. Others were cracked open slightly, just enough to remind you that someone had lived there. But the weaver's door, it never opened. Not when the bells rang for the dead, not when the procession passed with incense and ash, not even when the priest left a small cross of twigs by the step. Still, people waited, quietly, respectfully, as though the silence inside was not absence but choice. You began to whisper greetings when you passed, soft, so no one else would hear. A habit, a kindness. Good morning, you'd say. Or, I remember your scarf. Once you even paused and hummed a few bars of the mother's old song, the one about rain and apples. The the one you hadn't heard in months. You thought, just maybe, someone inside was listening. And then one morning, you came, and the red had faded. Not gone, just weathered. A crust of bread lay uneaten. The candle stub had melted flat. A yellow scarf fluttered from the shutter, pinned by a nail, stained and sun-bleached. You stood there a long time, uncertain. You stepped forward. You knocked. No answer. You knocked again. Still nothing. But as you turned to leave, you noticed a small symbol scratched into the step. A spiral, faint but deliberate, drawn in ash. A sign, not of goodbye, but of memory. You touched it gently, then walked away. The door stayed shut, but it no longer felt like an end. He came just after sunrise, walking the road from the east, with a gait too steady for the hungry and too slow for the lost. Dust cloaked his shoulders, and the hem of his robe was torn, stained with earth and something darker. No cart, no horse, no coin purse, only a wooden staff and a book, bound in leather and wrapped in cloth. He stopped just beyond the stone marker at the edge of the village, and looked up, not at the houses, not at the chapel spire, but at the sky, as if reading something written in light. You saw him first. You had risen early to fetch water, though the well still wept nothing. You watched him approach, quiet and tall, the lines of his face drawn with age or sorrow or both. When he reached the square, he paused, then knelt. Not in exhaustion, in reverence. He did not speak his name. He never would. The villagers gathered slowly, drawn not by command but curiosity. He didn't beg, he didn't preach. He simply opened his book. Pages worn thin, symbols inked in a language no one recognized. Some were pictures, some were maps, others looked like stars. He touched one with his finger, tapped it twice, then closed the book again. A child asked him where he came from. He smiled but said nothing. A woman offered him a crust of bread. He broke it in half and gave her back the larger piece. The healer asked if he was looking for someone. He only looked to the chapel and shook his head. Once, slowly. He slept beneath the fig tree that night, curled in his robe, his book clutched tight beneath one arm. You brought him a blanket, though he didn't stir. In the morning he rose before you did, already walking toward the edge of town, when the mist still kissed the stones. But he stayed, one day, and then another, always silent, always walking. He traced circles in the dust with the end of his staff, then wiped them away. He sat beside the sick without fear, laying a hand on their brows, whispering something no one could hear. Some said he was a prophet, others said he was a ghost, walking backward through death, retracing his life. A man offered him coin. He refused. A widow asked for a blessing. He knelt, touched her hand, and smiled. By the 5th day, he was called Pilgrim. The name passed from mouth to mouth like a prayer. A boy claimed the pilgrim had drawn salt from a dry well. A girl said he had touched her mother's cheek, and the fever broke by nightfall. Truth or not, no one questioned it. In a world so emptied, even rumors felt holy. The chapel opened its doors for him. The priest, once skeptical, bowed his head when the pilgrim passed. You saw the priest slip him a folded note one evening, something scrawled quickly, handed with trembling fingers. The pilgrim read it, nodded, and burned it with a flint and twig. The ashes blew toward the orchard. He never wept. But once, you caught him staring into the smoke of a neighbor's fire, his face lined with a grief so quiet it felt older than time. You didn't speak to him then. You simply sat nearby, your silence an offering. On the 7th morning he stood in the square at first light and sang. No words. Just a melody, low and deep, rising like the breath of the earth. It echoed between the stone houses, curled into the alleyways, touched the lintels and the locked shutters. People stepped outside, one by one. They listened. They cried. No one joined him. No one needed to. When the song ended, he closed his book, tied it again with cloth, and began to walk. No farewell, no promise. Just the steady rhythm of his staff against the stone, fading with the light. You followed him as far as the lavender field, your steps light, your breath catching with every pace. But he did not stop, and something told you not to call out, not to ask where he was going. Some journeys were meant to remain unnamed. At the bend in the road he paused. He turned, just slightly, and met your eyes, then nodded once, as though he had been waiting for you to arrive. You wanted to ask him, "Were you ever sick? Did you lose someone? What is written in your book?" But you said nothing. Instead, you bowed, and then he was gone, swallowed by the morning mist, his song still lingering in the hollows of the earth, like the echo of a bell rung in a dream. You returned to the village with silence in your pockets, and the memory of a man who had said nothing, but left everything behind. They said the bird came from the sea, carried inland on the mast of a plague ship that never docked, its sails torn by wind and riddled with silence. They said it perched at the very tip of the highest mast and refused to move, even as the sailors burned below deck. When the flames turned to smoke, it took flight, a single shape, against the ash-streaked sky, and then it came here. You didn't see it arrive. No one did. But one morning it was there, black as midnight, feathers dull as coal, standing atop the cathedral's steeple, like a sentinel. Its eyes glinted red in the morning sun. Its cry cracked the sky. It didn't crow at dawn, as roosters should. It crowed at death. The first to fall was the baker's apprentice, young, round-faced, strong as stone. He had been healthy at dusk, singing to the dough as he needed, a smear of flour on his cheek. By midnight he burned with fever. By morning he was ash. The rooster crowed just before his breath failed. You remember standing in the square, shoulders hunched against the morning chill, as the sound echoed, strange, low and wrong, not a cock's cry, but a rasp, like a blade dragged across stone. The villagers looked up as one. It stood motionless on the steeple, feathers ruffled by the wind, gaze fixed nowhere and everywhere. A woman crossed herself. A child wept. Someone threw a stone. It missed. From that day forward, the crow marked each death. Not every cough, not every fever, but the moment life left, the very moment. It called out. The sound came whether the dying lay in their bed, in the field, beneath the chapel floor, always the same tone, always the same length, no more than a breath, and then silence. The townsfolk whispered of omens, of curses. They scrawled protective symbols on their doors, hung dried rosemary in their chimneys. But the crow still came, sometimes twice in a night, sometimes more. People stopped lighting candles after sundown, hoping the darkness might hide them. It did not. The priests called it blasphemy. The herbalists called it warning. The sailors passing through said it was the ghost of a mariner who died without sacrament, come back feathered and vengeful, pecking death into the hearts of the living. No one dared climb the steeple, until the boy, barefoot, 12, and silent. No one remembered his name. He tied a pouch of salt around his neck, said nothing to his mother, and scaled the tower before dawn. When the sun rose, he stood face to beak with the rooster, his silhouette framed by the first light. He reached out once. It didn't move. He returned that morning without blood or bruise. When asked what he'd seen, he said only, "It blinked." Then he went to bed and slept 3 days. When he woke, he would not speak of it again. Someone offered a reward for its capture. 3 silver coins and a loaf of good bread. A hunter from the east arrived with nets and arrows. He waited 3 nights beneath the steeple. On the 4th he was found cold beneath the cathedral steps, eyes open to the sky, mouth full of feathers, no wound, no blood. No one hunted the rooster after that. Instead, they tried to appease it. They left corn near the bell tower, drawn from precious stores, laid mirrors and coins at the base. A woman brought a chalice of wine and sang softly in a tongue no one recognized. It watched, always, unmoving. Then it crowed, and another home fell silent. You saw it once, up close, not on the steeple, but in the alley behind the tannery. You turned a corner, and there it was, standing in a pool of shadow, head tilted. It made no sound. You froze. Its eyes, deep, dark, glinting with something older than thought, met yours, and in that moment, you felt a weight you could not name settle in your chest. It hopped once, then vanished behind a crate. Later that night, the widow next door passed away. Still, the crow came. Even the bells gave up eventually. The priest no longer rang them. What purpose did they serve when a bird could speak death with such certainty? Instead, the villagers began marking each call with a stone in the square, one for each cry. By month's end, the pile was waist-high. And then, one morning, it was gone. The steeple stood empty, cold in the wind. No feathers, no claw marks, just the absence of weight, as if it had never perched there at all. But the deaths continued. And though no voice marked their passing, the villagers still looked up each morning, waiting for a sound that did not come. Some claimed they still heard the crow in dreams. Some said they saw feathers in the fields. You never did. But once, while walking the orchard at dusk, you stepped on something soft. You looked down, a single black feather. You left it there, and kept walking, never once looking back. They came from every direction, barefoot, hollow-eyed, clutching beads and bones, breathless from the climb. Pilgrims, dozens of them, drawn to the convent on the hill like moths to a flame they could not see. You followed them, your feet aching with each step up the winding path, past gnarled olive trees and crooked stones carved with names, long faded by rain. The wind carried the scent of lavender and damp earth. Far below, the village shrank into silence. At the summit stood the convent, old, sun-bleached, wrapped in ivy, with shuttered windows and a bell that no longer rang. A rusted gate creaked as it opened, and the pilgrims passed through without words, faces turned toward the chapel at its heart. That was where she slept, they said. The saint. She had never taken ill. Not once. Not when the fever gutted the valley below. Not when the priests died mid-sermon. Not even when her sisters faded, one by one, each buried beneath rose bushes in unmarked soil. She had remained in her cell, silent, unmoved, asleep. A miracle. You stepped through the heavy wooden door and felt the air shift. Cooler, heavier, laced with candle wax and breath held too long. The chapel was small, simple. The only adornment was her body, laid out in a bed of dried lavender and rosemary, hands crossed at her chest, hair fanned like a halo. She looked no older than 30, though they said she had been 60 when the plague began. Her lips were pale, her skin unblemished, her chest still. She had not moved in 97 days. They say God speaks to her, whispered a woman beside you, her voice reverent, barely sound. In dreams. Another swore the saint's hands had healed a child who brushed against them. A third pilgrim claimed her eyelids fluttered each time someone touched her rosary. You watched as people lined up, one by one, to kneel at her bedside, whispering prayers into the folds of her dress, leaving tokens, a silver ring, a dried fig, a lock of hair wrapped in string. You did not kneel. You stood at the threshold and watched. She did not stir. In the courtyard, a nun with a face lined by sun and sorrow handed out water steeped in lemon peel and clove. Her eyes were distant, voice thin. "It is not for healing," she said, "only comfort." The other nuns did not speak. They moved like shadows, their habits faded, their movements choreographed by grief. You noticed that none of them entered the chapel. None dared approach the bed. That night, the pilgrims slept outside beneath the olive trees, their heads resting on stone, their bodies curled like commas in a prayer, never finished. You dreamt of her, not walking or waking, but standing at the convent gate, holding a lantern. She didn't speak, only looked at you. Her eyes were empty. You woke before dawn, heart hollow. Back in the chapel, someone had lit 100 candles. Their light shimmered against the walls, painting the saint's face in gold and shadow. A child reached out and touched her foot. The girl's mother gasped, but the saint did not move. The foot was cold. Still, they stayed. On the third day, a man arrived with a scroll, parchment sealed with wax, cracked and fraying. He read aloud, a list of the dead from his village, each name spoken slowly, like a chant. He placed the scroll at the saint's side, kissed her hand, and left. The scroll was never moved. That evening, it rained hard. Without warning, the wind howled down from the mountains, scattering the olive branches, extinguishing half the candles. Some pilgrims wept, others lifted their faces to the sky, mouths open, catching the water like wine. Inside the chapel, the saint did not stir. Her blankets were damp by morning. You helped gather the wet offerings, now sagging with moisture, damped coins, ruined flowers, notes smeared, unreadable. You paused beside her, looked again into that face untouched by time, and for a moment, you saw it. The faintest movement, not breath, not blink, but something, a twitch perhaps, a tightening around the mouth, or a trick of light. You leaned closer. Her lips were parted, just slightly. You stepped back, unsure. The next day, the pilgrims began to leave, not disappointed, but hushed, like guests departing a wake where the dead had refused to rise. They took no relics, only silence. The nuns said nothing. You remained behind, walking the empty halls of the convent. You found the room where her sisters had once slept. The beds now bare, the floor swept clean. On the wall, someone had scratched a line into the plaster. She kept the storm outside. That evening, you wrote a name on a scrap of cloth, your mother's, and laid it beside her, not for healing, for remembrance. At dawn, you looked one last time. The saint lay unchanged, her hair slightly disturbed by the breeze, the scent of lavender stronger now. You left the chapel, and in the wind that followed you thought you heard a breath. He danced where no one else dared walk, barefoot on the stones of the plague road, where carts once rolled heavy with silence and cloth-wrapped sorrow. His clothes were a patchwork of faded silk and linen scraps, stitched together in spirals and stars. Bells dangled from his wrists and anchors, though they no longer rang. Their tongues had been removed, leaving only the quiet shimmer of forgotten music. You saw him first at dusk, balancing atop the crumbled fountain in the center of the dead quarter. The sun sank low behind the chapel spire, casting his silhouette long and crooked, like a marionette cut free from strings. He bowed low, theatrically, and with a wide sweep of his hand, welcomed no one, only the ghosts. Then he began to laugh, not the high-pitched cackle of madness, nor the soft chuckle of jesters from feast halls past, but something deeper, rough and warm, like gravel tumbling through honey. It filled the square like light might have, once. You stood at the edge, transfixed. The man wore a mask of painted wood, half smile, half tear, tied tightly with twine behind his head. The paint had cracked where his laughter stretched it too wide. No one approached him. Yet every evening he returned. Each night brought a new performance. A pantomime of villagers fleeing invisible monsters, of plague doctors dancing with brooms, of children pulling fever from their mouths like ribbons. One night he mimed death arriving at the baker's oven, knocking politely before climbing inside. Another evening, he sat on a stool and held a limp puppet shaped like a rat, singing to it in a language that might have once been French. He never spoke outside the act, never removed the mask. They called him the fool, the jester, the laughing one. But you heard the healer call him by a different name once. Le dernier joyeux, the last joyful. Some believed he was cursed, that the plague passed over him because he amused it. Others claimed he had buried his entire family and had gone mad in grief. The woman whispered that he'd once been a court fool in Avignon, dismissed after laughter became dangerous. You never asked. You weren't sure you wanted to know. You began watching him each night, hiding behind the broken lintels of a smithy long abandoned. Sometimes you were not alone. A child once sat beside you, clutching a rag doll. An old man leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, the corners of his eyes wet. None of you spoke. One night it rained. Still, the fool danced, slipping and spinning across slick cobblestones, arms outstretched, as if embracing the storm. He fell once, hard, the sound of bone on stone sharp in the night, but he laughed through it, louder than before. You saw blood on his knee, smeared like rouge. He painted a smile on the ground with it. The wind carried the sound through the village, over rooftops and locked shutters, through crumbling homes and shuttered chapels. And for the first time in weeks, someone else laughed. A boy high in the orchard trees, startled by joy. The fool stopped. He turned slowly, toward the sound, lifted his mask just slightly, not enough to reveal, but enough to nod. Then he resumed his dance. You began to leave small offerings near the fountain, a piece of fruit, a ribbon, once even a book of riddles. Others followed. Someone gave him a pair of gloves with bells. A woman left a mirror. He took them all, one by one, and worked them into his act. The gloves became wings, the mirror, a window through which he waved to the dead. He never took food, only the strange, only the beautiful. One morning he did not appear. You waited in the square long after the sun had gone. The night was heavy with fog, the stones slick beneath your feet. Still, no laughter, no mask, no trace. You returned the next day, and the next. On the third evening, you found something folded beneath the statue of Saint Catherine, his mask, laid neatly atop a pile of pebbles, its ribbons tied into a bow. Beside it, a note, smeared with ink and rain. I laughed so you wouldn't forget how. There was no name, only the mask. You lifted it gently, ran your fingers over the cracked paint. The smile still curved upward, but the tear had faded. You placed it in your satchel and walked home in silence. That night, as you stood by your hearth, you heard a sound, soft, fleeting, like the jingle of a bell long stilled, and you smiled. Not because you had forgotten the grief, but because he had reminded you what it meant to live beside it. You found it in a cupboard no larger than a child's coffin, behind a stack of broken crockery and a bag of dried beans gone soft with time. The room was dark, a healer's house, long abandoned, the windows boarded and the roof sighing with each gust of wind. You had not meant to stay long, just to scavenge. A scrap of linen, perhaps. A jar of preserved herbs. But then your hand brushed something flat, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. You tugged it free. The book was heavier than it looked. Its cover warped, its spine cracked but holding. The pages were thick with damp, their edges curled like dried leaves, yet the ink remained, brown with age, uneven, written by a hand both careful and hurried, a hand that had once hoped to remember, or to be remembered. You opened it gently. The first page bore no title, only a name, written in small cursive in the top corner. Magdalena, a healer of Saint Laurent. The ink had run in places, blurred by water or weeping. Beneath it, a list of dates. The last one had no year. The book was not orderly. It did not begin with fevers and end with prayers. Instead, it spiraled, a patchwork of recipes, notes, drawings, observations. Some pages were devoted to herbs, wormwood, yarrow, root, their uses listed in lines, for heat in the chest, for looseness of the bowels, for dreams that do not end. Others bore illustrations, crude but clear, a salve made from crushed beetles, a syrup brewed from pear skins and rosewater, a poultice of ash and salt to be laid across the brow. Scrawled in the margins, did not work on Thomas, try with vinegar. You sat by the hearth, candle trembling in its holder, and read for hours. Some entries were short, almost whispered. April 3. Marie's child died. The garlic was no use. She buried him with cloves beneath his tongue. May 10. Jan's rash broke. I burned the bedsheets. It didn't help. Others were longer, recountings of dreams, of voices heard while crushing time, of a vision seen in steam rising from a boiling pot. A woman made of smoke, her eyes full of nettles, whispering a cure with no name. You found pressed flowers between the pages, faded petals, fragile as moth wings. One crumbled at your touch. Another still held its scent, faint, bitter, familiar. You tucked it into your sleeve. At the center of the book, 2 pages had been sewn together. You unpicked the thread with care, heart drumming. Inside, a list. Not of remedies, but names. No titles, no causes, just names. 53. Some were crossed out, some were circled. One had a star beside it. You traced your finger along them, lips moving without sound. You knew too. You whispered them anyway. In the final pages, the script grew more hurried. The words jumbled, sentences unfinished. The poultice caused boils, but the fever broke. Still breathing, still breathing. I dreamed of fire. The herbs turned to ash in my hands. I tried again. It's not the cure that matters. It's the trying. It's the trying. Then, blank pages. 20 or more. You closed the book slowly, and understood. This had not been meant for success. It had been meant for the ones who came after. For hands like yours, trembling in the dark, searching through cupboards for something that might still mean life. For someone to pick up where she left off. You reached for your ink, and wrote a date at the top of the empty page. Then a recipe. It wasn't perfect. A broth of dandelion root and thyme, brewed slow, stirred with a silver spoon. You had seen it once, ease a child's cough. You didn't know why, only that it had helped. You wrote it down. The next day, you added another, a salve of marigold and vinegar, mixed with honey and ash, to be rubbed into the soles of the feet. The day after, a note. This soothed her. She slept. By week's end, you had filled 5 pages. The book remained open beside your bed. A second heartbeat. Others came. The shepherd, the midwife, a boy no older than 10, each bringing something, a method, a memory, a mistake. You let them add to the margins, let them draw their hopes in ink. You began calling it the book, no longer hers, ours. When the fever came again to your door, you opened to the marked page, followed the instructions, whispered the prayer she had scrawled in the corner of page 12. Your sister slept, still breathing, still breathing. It began as nothing, a cluster of weeds pushing through the cracks between the stones behind the chapel, pale green, trembling in the wind, unwelcome. You noticed them one morning as you fetched water, bending low to pluck them out. But when your fingers brushed the leaves, you paused. Not weeds, something familiar, something softer. Time. The scent rose to your nose like a memory, sharp, sweet, stubborn. You let it be. By the next week, parsley had joined it, followed by wild mustard, small, brave shoots pushing upward through ash and soil packed by sorrow. You knelt in the dust, fingers brushing the leaves, the warmth of the sun licking at the back of your neck. It was the first time you'd felt it in months. The warmth, not just of sun, but of something living. You cleared space behind your cottage that afternoon. The ground was hard, reluctant to yield, but you knew how to coax it. The earth remembered. Beneath the soot and the bones of forgotten seasons, it was still there, patient, breathing. You dug with your hands at first, then with a broken ladle. Then, as news spread, others came. The girl with the yellow scarf returned, knees muddied, humming quietly as she pressed bean seeds into furrows. The shepherd, his flock now reduced to 3, brought sheep dung for fertilizer. The old woman who used to sell ribbons arrived with handfuls of fennel seeds tucked into her apron, wrapped in pages from her wedding book. It was not planned. It simply grew. They brought what they had. Garlic bulbs saved from winter, sprouting onions, marigolds from a forgotten bouquet. Someone planted lavender, the stems dry and grey, but still clinging to scent. A child buried a peach pit with solemn ceremony. A nun arrived with a single strawberry plant, cradled in a cracked bowl. You made space for all of it. Each day brought new hands. Not many, just enough. No one spoke loudly. There was no need. The sound of digging, the soft grunt of work, the occasional murmur of a remembered recipe, these became your song. The soil warmed slowly. The wind grew softer. Rain came not as punishment, but promise. For the first time in seasons, the air smelled of damp loam and crushed mint, not vinegar and grief. You began keeping a book, not of remedies, but of growth. A single page for each sprout. You noted when it was planted, who brought it, what memory it carried. Radish, from Luca, said his mother used to pickle them with cloves. Carrot, crooked, dug up on St. Agatha's Day. No name attached. The chapel bell rang one morning, not for death, but for help. A row of young tomato plants had wilted in the heat, and the priest needed shadecloth. By midday, 3 villagers had brought old cloaks to hang. The garden wrapped itself around the chapel, like a second skin. Beans curled up the cracked stone wall. Basil clustered beneath the altar window. Marjoram lined the edge of the old baptismal font, now filled with rainwater and home to frogs. It was not beautiful. Not yet. But it was alive. And so were you. You found yourself rising before the sun, moving through the beds in bare feet, the dirt cool beneath your soles. You spoke to the plants without thinking, not in prayer but in greeting. They did not answer, but they listened. The children played between the rows now, quiet games of counting leaves and naming worms. One boy wore a crown, made of parsley. A girl claimed she saw her mother's smile in a sunflower's face. You did not correct her. You had stopped marking the deaths on the chapel door. Instead, each new bloom was marked in chalk, a tally of life. The old fear had not vanished, but it had softened, like soil after a long frost. No longer frozen, just waiting. You harvested your first radish with shaking hands. Small, misshapen, stubborn. You bit into it. It burned your tongue. You wept. That night the villagers gathered, not for a funeral, but a meal. Bread baked with rosemary. Soup made from peas and garlic scapes. No feasting, just sharing. Quiet. Reverent. The jester's mask was placed on a stool beside the table. You toasted him with parsley tea. And beneath the stars, someone played a lyre. Out of tune, strings worn. Still, the sound carried, and no one asked for silence. The garden breathed. And with it, she stood beside the wall at dusk, her shadow long and trembling like the breath of a candle, hair in loose braids, fingers curled around the edge of your cloak. She didn't speak at first, just watched the sky, that strange kind of twilight where the sun is gone, but the dark hasn't settled. You were stacking firewood, slow, deliberate, letting the quiet fill the spaces where words used to live. Then she asked, "Why did the bells stop?" You froze, one hand on a crooked log, the other reaching for something that wasn't there. Not in your pocket, not in your memory. She looked up at you, wide-eyed, waiting not for a lesson, but a story. You crouched to her height, knees popping softly. She smelled of marigold and ash. Her eyes had seen too much and not enough. And still you didn't answer. Because how could you? How do you explain absence to someone who still believes everything should return? So you began where you could. There used to be music, you said. Every morning someone sang while baking bread. She nodded. She liked bread. There was a man who wore yellow shoes. He danced when it rained. Her brow furrowed, trying to imagine such a thing. There was a woman who painted birds on her shutters. Blue ones. I used to count them on my way to market. She waited. You paused. And then the world got quiet. Why? She asked again. You opened your mouth, closed it, picked up the log, set it gently on the stack, took her hand, walked down the path where the lavender was blooming again, faint but sure, past the chapel, where moss had crept over the stones like a second skin, into the orchard, where only 2 trees still bore fruit, and even that in secret. You pointed to a bench, the one with initials carved by someone long forgotten. She climbed onto it, legs swinging. It was a sickness, you said finally. It came in the night, like a storm without thunder. Did it hurt? Yes, you said, but not always in the body. She was quiet for a long time, eyes fixed on the horizon. Then she asked, "Did you know my brother?" You nodded. He had a song, you whispered. He used to hum it when he fed the goats. She smiled. Just slightly. I remember. There it was, memory, woven like thread between you, fragile but strong enough to carry weight. I found this, she said, pulling a small stone from her pocket. Round, smooth, with a line of quartz cutting through it like a scar. I think it's lucky. You held it in your palm. It was warm. It had been in her hand for some time. She didn't say what she wanted you to do with it. She didn't need to. You carried it back with you, placed it on the windowsill beside a dried fig and a pressed daisy, a growing shrine to things too small to explain. The next morning you began to write. Not in the book of remedies. That was for the sick. This was for the living. You found scraps of parchment, stitched them with thread, and began with her question. Why did the bells stop? Each page carried a voice, a face, a memory, not a history, a remembering. You wrote of the mother who covered her child with rosemary before opening the door, of the man who burned his garden, weeping, of the friar who sang to an empty chapel for 32 days before falling silent, of the girl with the yellow scarf who painted suns on every wall she could reach. You did not name the sickness. You did not count the dead. You named the ones who told jokes, who shared onions, who whispered stories by candlelight when breath grew scarce. One afternoon, the child returned. You let her write a page. She drew a picture of a goat, named it Felix. He was brave, she said. You nodded. Then he belongs in the book. She left a handful of grass beside his page. You pressed it flat. By summer's end, the book was thick. Its cover faded, its pages dog-eared, its contents uneven. A song here, a prayer there, a dried violet, a joke scrawled in charcoal. The last words of a jest. Not a record, a refuge. One day, she came to you again. Older now, just slightly. She didn't ask why. She only said, "Tell me again." So you did, from the beginning. And this time when you reached the silence, she didn't flinch. She listened. And when you were finished, she asked, "Can I tell it next time?"
You smiled.
You must. The path to the village feels unfamiliar now, though your feet have traced it 100 times. The stones are still there, uneven, smoothed by centuries, but the silence has shifted. It is no longer the silence of fear, or mourning, or waiting. It is something soft, like a pause between breaths, the hush before a song begins. You walk slowly, your fingers brushing the tops of tall grass, golden and trembling in the morning light. The air is no longer thick with vinegar or smoke, no sweet rot of herbs hung to rot, just wind, just sky, just breath. The lavender is blooming again. You pass the field where the plague carts once rolled, where the soil had turned hard from the weight of grief. Now, a boy tends to onions there, his sleeves rolled high, hands dark with earth, whistling a tune you faintly remember. You raise a hand in greeting, he grins. Further on, a door stands open. That house was sealed once, painted with red crosses, its windows shuttered even in summer. Today, the shutters are thrown wide. A curtain dances in the wind. Inside, a kettle hums. You reach the square. It has no statue, no shrine, no marker for the lost. Just people. Someone is washing linens in a basin near the well. A girl is drawing birds in chalk on the cobblestones. A dog dozes beneath a bench where 3 elders play a game of stones, their laughter low and cracked. The well bucket creaks as it rises. You dip your hands into the water. Let it run through your fingers. It smells of nothing. It tastes clean. Behind you, someone is singing, not for ceremony, not in grief, but out of habit. A melody without words. You turn down the alley where the jester once danced. The stones still bear the faint marks of his chalk, ghosts of his steps. His mask hangs in the apothecary window now, framed by rosemary and glass bottles filled with light. Below it, someone has painted a sign, laughter remembered. A man stops beside you. Do you remember the smoke? He asks. You nod. I still dream of it, he says. Sometimes I wake with the smell in my nose. You don't reply. You don't need to. Instead, you walk together toward the chapel. The garden has grown wild. Bees drift between marigolds and sage. The thyme sprawls over the steps. A sunflower leans toward the door like it's listening. The book lies open on a table near the entrance, its pages fluttering in the breeze. Someone has drawn a lamb beside a recipe for rosemary broth. Below it, a child's handwriting reads, "For feeling better on sad days." You enter the chapel. No one is preaching, no incense, no sermon, just quiet. Candles burn, spaced far apart. A woman sits in the front pew, eyes closed, lips moving soundlessly. She holds a stone in one hand, smooth, marked with a single line of quartz. You take your seat near the back. You do not pray. You remember faces, hands, laughter, the sound of the rooster, the way grief moved like fog through the streets, settling in every fold of cloth. You remember those who bled, those who burned herbs, those who danced, or wept, or held their breath. You remember the strange things they did, not because they worked, but because they had to do something, anything. You remember the ones who survived. You light a candle, not for protection, not for luck, but because some lights are meant to remain, even after the storm. Outside, the sun is higher now. The bells do not ring. They do not need to. There is no music, no procession, no cue, only people, only morning. And the smoke has lifted, as the last flame flickers in this long and quiet journey. Thank you for walking with me through the dust and memory of a forgotten time. If this story brought you peace, I hope you'll return to hear the next. Subscribe, if your heart wishes to remember with us again. Now tell me, which part of this story stayed with you the longest? As the last whisper of incense fades from this strange journey, thank you for walking these darkened paths with me. If the story stirred something deep within you, subscribe, and return again when the world is too loud and history still has songs to sing. What remedy in this story struck you the most and why? Could you have kept your faith when even the sky seemed silent? Which part of this journey stayed with you?